The chances of you running into a serial killer are extremely low, but not impossible. And tonight, we're diving deep into the dark heart of America, one state at a time, to uncover one serial killer from every single one of them. Isn't this pretty funny having the thumbnail up? I'm gonna look just how I do in that picture. There is something I quickly want to say. The Monday that you guys are watching, the Cinco de Mayo, is actually my son's birthday. In case you guys don't know, I am a single father to this amazing kitten. His name is Mojo. A lot of you guys already know him because he's the co-host of my podcast. You're 7 when this video comes out. Look over there. Look at the camera. Look over here with a mic. He's been with me throughout everything. I'm so thankful for you, Moyo. I'm sure the fans love you. You know, it's my son. I gotta give him a little shout out. Since we're talking about serial killers all around America, there are gonna be a lot of people saying, well, you didn't say the full story. He actually did all this. It's like, dude, this video is already an hour long. Please. Yes, these are all gonna be somewhat summarizations of what these people did. I can't get into every single thing that these serial killers did. I just can't. This is part of my one blank from every state series, so there's a playlist at the top right if you want to go check these out. And please leave suggestions for what you guys want to see one blank of from every state. Our definition for serial killer, like our ages 1 to 100 video, is 2 murders or more. So the person would have had to kill 2 people or more to make it on this list. Is there really much to say? I don't think so. This video is definitely over an hour long, so if you like the effort put in, maybe you could leave a like, and maybe I could earn your subscription by the end of this video. With that being said, if you don't know the order that we go through, I like to go from left to right on the map. So we're starting with Washington. Robert Lee Yates. Robert Lee Yates lived the double life of a U.S. Army pilot by day and serial killer by night. Born on May 27, 1952 in Oak Harbor, Washington, he grew up with a middle-class family with significant trauma. He had a kind of controlling relationship with his mother, who passed away from cancer when he was just 24. And that wasn't all, because his grandmother murdered his grandfather with an axe in 1945. And Yates was essayed by an older neighbor at 6. Just plenty of traumatic stuff. Anyway, Yates would go on and enlist in the U.S. Army in 1977 and become a decorated helicopter pilot. Then, in 1974, he divorced his first wife, Shirley Nylandergott, then married Linda Brewer. Interestingly, they had to have a second wedding in 1976 because his divorce hadn't been finalized in 74. Overall, Yates was seen as a family man and respected member of his community, but soon enough, it would be apparent that all this was a front. Between 1975 and 1998, he murdered at least 16 women, mostly sex workers and drug addicts, using a .25 caliber handgun. He shot his victims in the head and left their bodies with plastic bags over their heads. This came to light because during the late 1990s, a task force had investigated a series of unsolved murders in Spokane, and surveillance and witness reports pointed to a pattern, though it hadn't led to a suspect yet. What turned the scales was when in 1999, Yates' wife Linda reported that he returned home at 6:30 a.m. with blood in the van. Strange, because he had been taking out their daughter to work. Yates claimed it was from hitting a dog, but Linda later recalled he cleaned it a lot, including a blood-stained cushion which she found suspicious. The suspicion and everything else then led to September of 1999 when detectives finally visited Yates' home, having circled in on him. He agreed to an interview on September 15th where he denied soliciting prostitutes and refused to provide a DNA sample, citing the invasive nature of the request for a family man. Things weren't quite over yet because the next year, a survivor came forward with critical information, and one thing led to another, and DNA from Jennifer Joseph's murder, one of the many victims, linked Yates to the crime. Also, apparently his white Corvette was seen near several crime scenes. Yates was finally arrested, and then he confessed to killing 13 women. In 2002, he was sentenced to death. He filed a restraint petition, but in 2013, the Washington Supreme Court dismissed it. Yates had compared his sentence to Gary Ridgway's, another killer, arguing his confession deserved a life sentence. In 2018, he sort of got his wish because his death sentence was commuted to life without parole. He remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary. Oregon, the killer who kept his victims' shoes. In the late 1960s, a series of disturbing murders in Oregon led investigators to a guy named Jerome Henry Brudos, better known as Jerry Brudos. Born January 31st of 1939, Brudos had a strained relationship with his mother and developed a fixation on women's shoes from a young age. At just 5 years old, for instance, he reportedly stole a pair of high heels from a neighbor. This obsession grew into a dangerous crime pattern, and at 17, after abducting and assaulting a young girl, Jerome Brudos was arrested and even sent to the Oregon State Hospital for a 9-month psychiatric evaluation. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but for some reason got released after a short psychiatric evaluation. situation. Fast forward to years later, between 1968 and 1969, women like Linda Slauson, Jan Susan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Saley disappeared in the Portland and Salem areas, and as you might guess, it later came to light that it was all thanks to Brutus. Brutus apparently lured them into his home where he strangled and photographed their bodies, often keeping trophies such as shoes and body parts. He sometimes stored the bodies in his garage, where he set up a pulley system for photo shoots. Pretty messed up overall, but something that was found suspicious is that his wife claimed she knew none of it, as she had been forbidden from entering the garage without his permission. Anyway, Brutus was arrested in May of 1969 when the police began suspecting him after 3 college students reported strange phone calls from a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran. Following a thorough investigation, he was directly linked to at least 4 murders, to which he actually confessed in detail. He got sentenced to life and remained incarcerated until his death in 2006 from liver cancer. He had been the longest serving inmate in Oregon at the time. California, the Scorecard Killer. What if I told you there's a man who hunted young men for over a decade, keeping a twisted score of his victims like trophies? Yup, that happened. And the man in question is Randy Stephen Kraft, also known as the Scorecard Killer. He literally terrorized California, Oregon, and Michigan from 1972 to 1983, and though convicted of 16 murders, authorities suspect that he may have killed as many as 51 people. And as for the nickname Scorecard Killer, he earned it after investigators discovered a list of 61 cryptic entries, each believed to reference a victim. Born in Long Beach in 1945, Kraft grew up in a slightly dysfunctional but okay family. He had a distant father, 3 older sisters, and a loving mother. As a teenager, he excelled academically and was involved in politics, even aspiring to become a US senator. However, he also struggled with his sexual orientation, which he kept secret until later in life. Also, for the most part, his life seemed pretty normal until his first known offense occurred in 1970, when he assaulted a 13-year-old boy. A year later, he is suspected to have begun killing, with the first victim said to be Wayne Joseph Duquette. He went on and developed an MO. His victims were typically boys and young men, often picked up hitchhiking or lured from gay bars. Many were tortured, mutilated, and left near freeways, leading to his second nickname, the Freeway Killer. About 13 years later, in 1983, he was finally arrested with a body in his car. Investigators uncovered damning evidence, including photographs and the coded scorecard that I just mentioned. His trial began in September of 1988, lasting 13 months and becoming Orange County's most expensive. And interestingly, although expected, despite overwhelming evidence, his defense had denied him being responsible for any of the murders. On May 12th of 1989, though, he was found guilty of 16 murders and sentenced to death on November 29th that same year. As of 2024, he remains on death row at the San Quentin State Prison. Alaska, Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes, born on January 7, 1978 in Richmond, Utah, grew up in isolation in Washington State, where he exhibited violent tendencies early on in life. Stuff like hunting animals, committing arson, and even torturing pets. His family's involvement in the white supremacist Christian Identity Church further influenced his behavior negatively. Anyway, later on, after serving in the US Army, Keyes went on to settle in Alaska, where he started a construction business but then secretly engaged in violent crimes, including burglaries, arson, and bank robberies across the country. Also, Keyes apparently had a fascination with other serial killers at this time of his life. He, for instance, admired Ted Bundy and Dennis Rader, and even studied their methods in detail. That's how he got into his murderous sprees. His confirmed victims include Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old barista, whom he abducted in 2012 from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, and Bill and Lorraine Currier, a couple he murdered in Vermont in 2011. He also left behind a kill kit containing weapons and ammunition, buried across several states, including New York. While he confessed to some murders, the full extent of his crimes remain uncertain. He's suspected of killing other individuals, such as Julie Harris and Deborah Feldman. The FBI also investigated Keyes' possible ties to disappearances across multiple states, including a potential link to the Boca Killer and missing people in Florida and Texas. While in jail, Keyes committed with a razor blade. This was in December of 2012. Later on, the FBI released 11 drawings of skulls and a pentagram, all which he had drawn in blood. They believed it had something to do with the number of his victims. No one knows for sure though. Idaho, Joseph Edward Duncan III. Born on February 25, 1963 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Duncan grew up in a military family that moved frequently. His childhood had already been filled with instability, and after his parents divorced in 1983, life took an even darker turn. Actually, his descent into darkness had already begun at a younger age due to the instability, but it wasn't until he was about 15 that it all erupted. This was when he committed his first known crime, essaying a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint in 1978. This act of violence set the stage for what would be a long history of criminal behavior. In 1980, for instance, he abducted and essayed a 14-year-old boy, leading to a 20-year prison sentence. After serving 14 years, he was released on parole in 1994, but the darkness within him was far from extinguished. While living in the Seattle area, for example, he was accused of even more crimes, including the disappearances of 2 young girls, 11-year-old Samieja White and her half-sister 9-year-old Carmen Cubius, who vanished on July 6, 1996. Their remains were discovered in 1998, but Duncan wasn't charged for these crimes at the time. Then he would go on to kill 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California. On April 4th, while playing outside, Anthony was lured by Duncan, who spun a tale about a missing cat and abducted him. After a 2-week search, Anthony's body was found in Indio, California, bound with duct tape. In 2005, Duncan's criminal past caught up with him after he was charged with again essaying 2 boys in Minnesota. Somehow though, after posting bail, he disappeared. Just a month later, other murders would come up in relation to him. I'm talking about the brutal murders of Brenda Groen, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her son Slade, who were discovered in Idaho. Her children Dylan and Shasta were also missing. A nationwide search led to Shasta's rescue on July 2nd when she was spotted at a Denny's with Duncan. Dylan's body was found days later in Montana. All that, however, caught up with him, and with enough evidence, he was arrested. His confessions tied him to other abductions, and he was sentenced to death in 2008 after pleading guilty. Nevada, the Casanova killer. Paul John Knowles, born April 25th of 1946 in Orlando, Florida, was raised in foster homes and incarcerated by 19. After being released from Florida's Ryford prison in 1974, he flew to San Francisco to be with Angela Kovic, but she ended their engagement. In anger, Knowles claimed to have killed 3 people that night, though this was never verified. In July of 1974, he escaped from a Florida detention center after a bar fight and began a 4-month killing spree across the US. His first victim was Alice Curtis, whom he bound and gagged and who sadly choked on her dentures. He also allegedly murdered 2 young girls, Lillian and Millette Anderson, and continued his rampage through Ohio, Nevada, and Alabama, claiming at least 10 lives. Notably, he kidnapped, tied up, gagged, and R-worded radio copywriter Barbara Maybe Abel in Alabama, but spared her after she offered to help him tell his story. Knowles' spree ended on November 17th of 1974 when he was captured by a Vietnam War vet, David Clark, in Georgia. On December 18th, while being transported, Knowles tried to escape grabbing a sheriff's handgun. The attempt was thwarted when Agent Ronnie Angel shot and killed him. Missouri, Joseph Paul Franklin, the racist killer. This is a truly disturbing story, one that weaves together murder, racism, a twisted ideology, and a nationwide killing spree. It's the story of a man by the name James Clayton Vaughn Jr. from Mobile, Alabama. Born on April 13, 1950, Franklin had a rough start. His childhood was marked by severe abuse and neglect, with his father, for example, abandoning the family when he was just 8. As he grew older, his feelings of anger and resentment grew, leading him to racist ideologies, first through evangelical Christianity, then Nazism. This deepened as he changed his name to Joseph Paul Franklin, honoring Paul Joseph Goebbels and Benjamin Franklin. By the late 1970s, Franklin had began his brutal crimes. Using a sniper rifle, his first victims were an interracial couple in Wisconsin in 1977. His spree continued across 11 states. He bombed the synagogue in Tennessee, yes, bombed, narrowly avoiding mass casualties, and in Wisconsin, he shot and killed 2 men, Alphonse Manning Jr. and Tony Schwen. His killing continued with more murders, including the targeted shooting of Gerald Gordon near a synagogue in Missouri, which he would later confess to. He also targeted and shot a public figure, Larry Flint, leaving him paralyzed. And in Utah, he murdered 2 black men. In 1980, Franklin was arrested in Florida after being linked to these multiple murders. Convicted and sentenced to life, he was also sentenced to death for Gerald Gordon's murder in Missouri. Despite appeals, Franklin was executed by lethal injection on November 20th of 2013 at 63. His execution was notable as Missouri used a single drug lethal injection method for the first time, in response to the European Union's export ban on execution drugs that would have otherwise been used in that case. Arizona, the serial shooters Dale Hausner and Samuel Dieteman. Imagine living in a city where you could simply be gunned down without any warning, and not by your enemies or anyone you have beef with, just random people shooting other people. That was the sort of terrifying reality in Phoenix, Arizona between 2005 and 2006. A spree of random shootings by Dale Hausner and Samuel Dieteman paralyzed the city with fear for months. Over the 14 months fueled by methamphetamine, they committed drive-by shootings targeting pedestrians and animals, killing at least 8 and injuring 19. They also set fires, causing millions in damages. Initially thought to be the work of a single gunman, it became clear by 2006 that Phoenix had 2 killers, Hausner, a 33-year-old custodian and boxer, and Dieteman. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that last name incorrectly, but sorry if your last name is Dieteman. a petty criminal from Minnesota, who together randomly shot victims, including Nathaniel Hausner, who was killed while protecting his dog. The investigation broke through when Dieteman's friend, Ron Horton, came forward, revealing Dieteman had apparently confessed to him about the whole thing. On August 3rd of 2006, both men were arrested. Hausner's brother, Jeff, was also implicated, having assisted in a stabbing and potentially some shootings. He was sentenced to 25 years. Hausner was convicted of 6 murders and some other charges and sentenced to death. He was found unresponsive in his cell on March 30th of 2013. Dieteman, on the other hand, was sentenced to life. He admitted to at least 2 of the murders. Montana. He killed 4 people in 4 months. This one starts in a homeless shelter in Missoula, Montana, where a man named Ronald James Ward was trying to start over. He was quiet and kind to kids, and even worked as a football coach, but he had apparently had a history of heavy drug use, failed jobs, and a dysfunctional childhood. He once described his childhood as, quote, 8 stepmothers and a father who gave his wife syphilis, end quote. By 2000, Ward was spiraling out of control, bouncing across states, drinking moonshine, and drifting aimlessly. Now here's the thing. In a period of 4 months, coinciding with this time he was drifting, 4 people were killed across the country, and it all came back to Ward. The whole thing began with Kristen Lorite, a 25-year-old from New Jersey on her way to California. She stopped her van at an Arkansas rest area to let her dogs run. Ward, high on heroin, spotted her, pulled over, and followed her. She was found stabbed 10 times in the neck and dumped behind the rest stop. Her sundress was torn off, and maybe rather heartwarmingly or incredibly sad, it was her dogs that led police to her body. By December, Ward was in California, where he killed Jackie Travis, and then Sheila Polly, a 32-year-old mother. Polly was seen with Ward before she vanished. Ward was arrested in Merced and confessed to Patricia's murder, but the other killings remained unsolved until 2007, when DNA linked him to Lorite's death. Her family had actually waited years, even putting up a billboard asking, "Do you know who killed me?" He pleaded no contest, claiming memory loss but acknowledging the DNA. More DNA also connected him to the murders of Polly and Travis. FBI profiler John Douglas believes Ward had more victims, but this was never proven. Ward died in 2014 in a high-security prison in Deer Lodge, Montana, with the cause of death remaining undisclosed. Wyoming. Mark Hopkinson's descent into murder. Mark Allen Hopkinson's life went from a promising football career to a notorious criminal. Born on October 8th of 1949 in Evanston, Wyoming, he had left the town, as any other talented kid would, for a football scholarship at the University of Arizona. In 1971, though, things began going wrong when he was convicted for delivering controlled substances. He actually served time for that in a federal prison before returning to Wyoming in 1975. Hopkinson's return somehow sparked a violent feud with attorney Vincent Vihar over water rights. Rather, they disagreed over water rights. During this time, Hopkinson connected with criminals like Jeff Green, Mike Hickey, and Jamie Hassell, becoming further involved in illegal activities. In 1977, he hired Hickey to carry out a bombing on August 7th, killing Vihar, his wife Beverly, and their son John. Investigators linked Hopkinson to other murders, including Kelly Wickheisie. Hickey, his criminal friend, testified against him, and Hopkinson tried to frame Hassell. In a chilling move, Hopkinson then orchestrated the murder of Jeff Green in 1979 to silence him. Green's body was found tortured, and phone records confirmed Hopkinson's involvement. By the end of 1979, Hopkinson was convicted of multiple murders. He was sentenced to death for Green's murder and life imprisonment for the Vihar murders. On January 22nd of 1992, Hopkinson was executed, becoming the first person in Wyoming to receive the death penalty for a crime for which he was not present as it happened. Colorado, linked to more victims after his death. By the way, I really should have changed my text for some of them because I'm literally squatting for some of these. But yeah, let's continue with this guy. In Colorado, we have Vincent Darrell Groves, a man who lived in Wheat Ridge just outside of Denver, and who ended up being one of the state's most prolific serial killers the state's ever seen. He grew up in a stable, middle-class family and excelled in sports during high school. However, by 1974, after dropping out of college, Groves went down a rabbit hole of crime, associating with the underworld of pimps and sex work. In the late 1970s, Groves pulled 17-year-old Jeanette Baca into prostitution, and unfortunately, he eventually led her to her death. Her body was found in 1978, strangled. Also, his girlfriend, Norma Halford, mysteriously vanished in 1979, and it was suspected he had something to do with it. Then, in 1981, Groves murdered 17-year-old Tammy Woodrum while camping, initially claiming she overdosed, but an autopsy revealed she'd been SA'd and strangled. He was sentenced to 12 years but served 5 before being paroled in 1987. After his release, Groves then SA'd a sex worker, Shayla Washington, but was acquitted at this time. However, more was to come because in 1990, DNA linked him to the murders of Juanita Lovato and Diane Mancera, resulting in a life sentence. He died in prison in 1996. And like I said in the beginning, after his death he got linked to more murders. In 2012, DNA connected him to 4 more victims: Emma Jennifer, Joyce Ramey, Peggy Cuff, and Pamela Montgomery. Authorities believe the actual victim count may have exceeded 20. New Mexico, movie extra who killed for fun. Clifton Bloomfield's life wasn't anything special until it took a dark turn in 2005. Born in 1969 in Kingman, Arizona, Bloomfield had a history of petty crimes. His first brush with the law came in 1979 after a BB gun incident, leading to probation and enrollment in a Tucson children's home. Afterward, he returned to his parents, who sent him to daily mental health clinics and treated him for mesoretisine for schizophrenia. This didn't help much because in 1989, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison after a crime spree with his sister in Phoenix. After his release in 2002, things only got worse. On October 24th of 2005, after eating at a Fuddruckers in Albuquerque, Bloomfield was approached by 37-year-old Carlos Escobil, who reportedly made advances toward him. Bloomfield agreed to go back to Escobil's apartment, where he strangled him with his own shirt and searched the place for valuables before leaving. 3 days later, at a different location in an unrelated incident, Bloomfield noticed a back door to a home slightly open and went inside. He searched a purse, took some jewelry, and was confronted by 81-year-old Josephine Selvage, a retired teacher with Alzheimer's. He overpowered and strangled her with a piece of clothing. Though the murders were days apart and nearby, police failed to link them. Bloomfield then took a break from killing, but not for long. In December of 2005, he held an elderly couple at gunpoint in Los Ranchos, stole cash, and rather bizarrely, proposed to his girlfriend the same day. He was arrested months later in Texas and served 18 months for the robbery. He then got released and went on to work as a roofer. He also found work as a movie extra, appearing in Felon and Breaking Bad. Resuming his killing in December of 2007, he killed Tak Yi and his wife Peng. Then on June 28th of 2008, he and Jason Skaggs broke into a home to kill a man named Manny, but accidentally killed 40-year-old Scott Pierce, who had just gotten married to Catherine Bailey 6 days before. That marked the end of his spree. On July 1st, 2008, Bloomfield and Skaggs were arrested for Pierce's murder. DNA evidence linked Bloomfield to the other killings. He pleaded guilty to 5 murders and was sentenced to 5 life terms plus 45 years. Hawaii, the serial killer who killed over rejection. Eugene Walter Barrett's life was marked by violence fueled by rejection and obsession. Born in Oakland in 1931, he grew up in Honolulu, dropped out in the 9th grade, and joined the U.S. Army during the Korean War. His heavy drinking led to a dishonorable discharge, starting a downward spiral. Back in Honolulu, he began dating Annie E. Phillips, a divorced mother of 5. Unemployed and drinking heavily, Barrett became enraged when she broke up with him in 1959. He shot her in front of her kids, was convicted and sentenced to life, later reduced to 15 to 50 years. Barrett was paroled in 1967 after serving time for the murder. In 1971, he married Roberta Aveiro, but she left him a year later, citing his alcoholism. Just 1 month after the divorce, Barrett found her at a Hawaii hotel and stabbed her to death. He pled guilty to manslaughter and received 10 years. By 1976, he was paroled again, and by 1982, all parole conditions were lifted. In the 1990s, he appeared to live quietly until he became obsessed with his neighbor, 41-year-old Roxanne Kastner, a single mother with a history of both substance and SA. Though no relationship was confirmed, Barrett accused her of mocking him and exposing herself. Fearing he might hurt her, he briefly sought psychiatric help, but on August 11th, 1995, after drinking, he spotted her outside, grabbed a gun, and shot her twice. Her son saw everything. At the preliminary hearings, 7-year-old Ethan testified against Barrett, becoming one of the youngest witnesses in state history. He described seeing Barrett leave the room shortly after finding his mother's body, a claim supported by neighbor Enrique Cristostamo, who heard gunshots and the boy crying. Barrett was arrested the next day after surrendering at the Columbia Inn. During the trial, his defense argued that his violent actions were the result of mistreatment by Kastner, but the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, and in 2003, he died from an undisclosed illness at Polymomy Medical Center. North Dakota. No one was ever caught. In 1931, Schaefer, North Dakota, became the site of the state's last lynching. It started with Charles Bannon, a 22-year-old farmhand for the well-off Haven family, a couple and their 4 kids who suddenly vanished in February of 1930. Bannon stayed behind, claiming they moved and left him in charge. That fall, he and his father James began selling off the Haven property, something which raised suspicions. Charles was arrested for grand larceny and confessed to accidentally killing 1 child, then murdering the rest out of fear. Though he insisted his father was uninvolved, James was arrested in Oregon and extradited. On January 23rd of 1931, Charles was transferred to Schaefer-Willingston Jail for his arraignment on 6 murder charges. Along with him were his father James, Deputy Sheriff Holland, and Fred Mike, who was in jail on theft charges. Just days later, in the early hours of January 29th, a mob of 75 stormed the jail, captured the sheriff, and dragged Bannon out with a noose around his neck. Taken first to the Haven farm but threatened by the caretaker, they then took him to Cherry Creek Bridge where he was lynched. The knot was apparently expertly tied. His body was buried in Williston. One theory behind the lynching, discussed in the book End of the Rope, was that locals suspected Bannon was responsible for a 1925 fire that killed 4 children in McKenzie County involving the Amlian family. And interestingly, he had also worked for this family. Governor Schaefer ordered an investigation, but no one was ever arrested. Meanwhile, James Bannon, his father, was convicted of the Haven murders in 1931 and sentenced to life. His appeal was denied, but he was paroled in 1950 at age 76. That's despite community belief that he was involved in a cover-up. South Dakota, the duct tape killer. This one's a chilling mix of horror, murder, and a disturbing trail of evidence. Robert Leroy Anderson, a seemingly ordinary guy from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, became known as the duct tape killer after his brutal murders of Larissa Dominski in 1994 and Piper Strail in 1996. But Anderson's early life didn't hint at the monster he would later become. He bounced around jobs, had a few failed marriages, and even worked at an amusement park where a freak roller coaster accident sent several people to the hospital. But by 1996, things took a strange turn. Anderson kidnapped 28-year-old Piper Strail right in front of her kids, driving off in his black vehicle. The investigation quickly zeroed in on him, who, after some weirdly contradictory statements, was linked to the crime. In his trailer, police found disturbing evidence which included blood-stained clothes, duct tape, and hairs matching Strail's. Soon, they connected him to the 1994 disappearance of Larissa Dominski as well. In 1999, Anderson was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death. The true inside story of Robert Leroy Anderson, written by Phil and Sandy Hammond with assistance from former South Dakota Attorney General Larry Long, was published in 2020. Long provided case files and personal insights, while part of the book's proceeds went to support domestic violence victims. In 2022, Shayna Fertig, Piper Strail's daughter, who witnessed her mother's kidnapping at age 3, just before her murder, released a book called A Call to Remember. The memoir reflects on her childhood decision not to testify against Anderson and her commitment to speak out as an adult, sharing her story. Nebraska, the revenge murders of Dr. Anthony Garcia. In 2008, 11-year-old Thomas Hunter and his family's housekeeper, Shirley Sherman, were brutally stabbed inside an Omaha home. With no apparent motive or suspect, the case went cold. Then, in 2013, there was another double homicide. Dr. Roger Brumback and his wife Mary were found murdered in their home. This time, detectives noticed a chilling connection. Both families had ties to Creighton University's pathology department, and both had a former medical resident in common, Anthony Garcia. Garcia had been fired from Creighton in 2001 following complaints from Dr. Brumback and Dr. William Hunter, Thomas's father. His career never recovered, plagued by failed residencies and medical board rejections. When Brumback refused to endorse him for a new license in 2013, Garcia returned to Omaha. At the Brumback home, detectives Moise and Warner found Dr. Roger Brumback shot and his wife Mary stabbed with kitchen knives. The scene mirrored the earlier murders of Thomas Hunter and Shirley Sherman. The couple had been dead for days, last seen in an online chat on Mother's Day. 4 days later, Dr. Shadna Butra reported a break-in attempt on Mother's Day, raising suspicions. Further investigation linked Garcia to both murders. He had purchased a firearm matching evidence found in the Brumback home. His credit card and phone records also placed him near the crime scene on the day of the killings. Garcia was arrested in Illinois on July 15, 2015, with a .45 caliber handgun and other incriminating items. At trial, DNA evidence, a car matching descriptions, and testimony from a former pole dancer who recalled Garcia bragging about the murders sealed his fate. In 2016, he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2018. His appeal for a new trial was rejected in 2023, and he remains on death row. Kansas, Edward Robinson. Imagine meeting someone online who promises you a new life, a new job, maybe even a fresh start. Now imagine that person is a serial killer using the same internet to trap you. John Edward Robinson did just that, luring women through chat rooms long before catfishing became a term. He would pose as a wealthy businessman. Born December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois, Robinson grew up in a troubled home with an abusive alcoholic father and a strict disciplinary mother. Despite this, he rose to become an Eagle Scout and even had a brush with fame meeting Judy Garland. After dropping out of college, Robinson turned to fraud, embezzling $33,000 from a medical practice in 1969 and receiving probation. Throughout the 70s, he continued fraud with fake credentials while holding respected roles like Scoutmaster on Sunday School Teacher. Robinson and his wife, Nancy, then moved to Lynn County, Kansas, where he used different scams to purchase a farm. Presenting himself as a successful businessman, he blended into the community while secretly using the isolated farm to imprison and murder his victims. His first known murder occurred in 1984 when Paula Guyleen Godfrey disappeared after a job interview. Over the next decade, he lured women through fake job offers and adoptions, including Lisa Stacy and her daughter in 1985 and Catherine Clampett in 1987. His crimes escalated when he began using the internet under the alias Slave Master. He would lure victims, promising submissive sex roleplay, only to enslave, essay, and murder them. In 1999, he murdered Isabella Lewicka, followed by Suzette Trouten in 2000, both found in chemical drums on his property. Robinson's downfall came in 2000 after a sexual battery charge led to a search of his farm, where investigators found 2 bodies. He was convicted of the murders of Trouten and Lewicka, sentenced to death, and pled guilty to 5 more murders, receiving a life sentence. Robinson remains on death row in Kansas, with his appeals continually being denied. Oklahoma. He killed his cousin at 13, but wasn't done yet. Wayne Henry Garrison grew up in Tulsa with a violent streak no one knew how to control. At 13, he strangled his 4-year-old cousin Dana Dean under his uncle's house. He confessed, was institutionalized, and then during a 10-day release in 1974, he killed again. This time, it was 3-year-old Craig Neal. Garrison suffocated him and hid the body under an abandoned house. He was sentenced to just 4 years. He got out at 17. He graduated high school, got married, and had a son. And in 1989, he was back at it again. He abducted 13-year-old Justin Wiles, a neighbor. Wiles was essayed, dismembered, and dumped in Lake Bixoma. Witnesses named Garrison, but the case stalled. In 1996, he went back to prison, this time for giving narcotics to an 11-year-old boy. That's when Oklahoma investigators made their move. They took a bite mark, interested in the dental pattern, from Garrison and exhumed Wiles. The dental evidence matched. In 1999, Garrison was arrested the moment he left prison. He was convicted in 2001 and sentenced to death. That sentence was later overturned. In 2007, he took a deal, life without parole. Justin's mother didn't care. Her view? Well, quote, as long as he'll never hurt another child again, end quote. Texas. Kenneth McDuff. The death row parolee. Kenneth Allen McDuff, born in 1946 in Rosebud, Texas, was the 5th of 6 children and apparently spoiled by his family, especially his mother Addie, known as the pistol-packing mama. In high school, he was a bully who quit school after, rather bizarrely, losing a fight and started working at his father's concrete business. By 18, he had multiple burglary convictions and was briefly imprisoned. On August 6th of 1966, McDuff and an acquaintance, Green, encountered teenagers Robert Brand, Edna Sullivan, and Mark Dunham in Everman, Texas. McDuff threatened them with a gun, forced the boys into a trunk, and shot them. He and Green then essayed Sullivan, after which McDuff strangled her with a broomstick and dumped her body. The next day, Green confessed to one of the boys' parents, who informed his mother. She then persuaded him to turn himself in, which led to McDuff's arrest and death sentence. Green in turn received a 25-year sentence. However, after the 1972 Furman v. Georgia ruling, McDuff's sentence was commuted. Gaining his freedom, and maybe unsurprisingly, McDuff resumed killing. He abducted and murdered Brenda Thompson, Valencia Joshua, and 22-year-old Melissa Northrup, a pregnant store clerk at a Waco Quick Pack. Soon after, in 1991, he and Alva Worley kidnapped 21-year-old Colleen Reed from an Austin car wash. McDuff essayed and tortured her as Worley drove. Worley later confessed, but Reed's body was never found. Meanwhile, McDuff fled to Kansas City under the name Richard Fowler. On May 1st of 1992, co-worker Gary Smithy recognized him on America's Most Wanted. After confirming Fowler's identity through a fingerprint match, police arrested McDuff. He was sentenced to death for Northrup's murder and executed on November 17th of 1998, finally revealing the location of Reed's remains before his death. He's buried in Byrd Cemetery with a headstone marking his execution date and death row number. Minnesota. The waitress killer who stalked victims. In Minnesota, Joseph Donald Turr Jr.'s crimes were not only brutal but calculated, with a pattern that revolved around stalking his victims. Born in St. Paul, Turr, like many other killers we're covering today, had a turbulent childhood with his parents' divorce and time spent in an orphanage. After a brief stint in the Marine Corps, he held low-paying jobs, and it's believed he spent time living in his car. In December of 1978, Turr's life took a turn. He entered the home of Alice Hewling in Clearwater, maybe intending to steal, but ended up murdering her and her 3 children. Only one child survived. His next victim was 19-year-old Marlis Wallenhaus, whom he brutally murdered in 1979 after breaking into her home. Then, in 1980, he abducted University of Minnesota student Diane Edwards after she finished her late shift at a local restaurant, taking her to the woods to assault and murder her. Turr had clearly established a disturbing pattern of targeting young women, often those working as waitresses. This had remained unknown until he was arrested in October of 1980 for unrelated SAs, and investigators connected him to those previous murders. Now, although Tur confessed to the Hewling family killings, he later recanted his confession. Also, he would have been eligible for parole, but in 1996, a grand jury indicted him for Marilis Wallenhaus's murder after a new investigation revealed his fabricated alibi. Following the indictment, Tur was interviewed on 48 Hours, but there, he maintained his innocence. After the interview aired though, several women came forward, identifying him as the man who had stalked and assaulted them in the 1970s. In 1997, Tur was convicted for Wallenhaus's murder and later indicted for the Hewling family killings. Now serving 6 life sentences at Minnesota Correctional Facility, his case was featured on Cold Case Files, and interestingly, Diane Edwards' murder inspired the 1983 punk song Diane by Husker Du. Alright guys, I'm done squatting. I feel like it's a workout, so I'm going to be leaning for some of them. So, Iowa. Murdered girlfriend and 5 kids with a hammer. In Iowa, we've got Adam Moss, a man whose crimes were so brutal, they're still considered the worst mass killing in the state's history. Moss had a long history of legal trouble, drug abuse, and violent behavior. By 2001, he was living in Sioux City with his girlfriend Leticia Aguilar and her 5 children. On the night of August 27th, Moss snapped. He crept through their home, bludgeoning each child to death with a hammer as they slept. Then he went to Leticia's room, hit her repeatedly in the face with the same hammer, and slit her throat. 2 days later, he killed again. This time, it was his friend and former boss, Ronald Fish. Same method, beaten to death with a hammer and stabbed with a knife. Police launched a manhunt and found Moss hiding behind a plywood stack the next day. After his arrest, Moss was indicted for the murders of his girlfriend, her 5 children, and Ron Fish. He initially maintained innocence, but later pleaded guilty to all 7 murders. Sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms, Moss was sent to Iowa State Penitentiary, where he was later moved to a mental health unit. In 2013, Moss was found unresponsive in his cell, hanging by a bedsheet tied to a vent, with no clear motive ever given for the killings. Missouri. The Kansas City Butcher. Robert Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher, kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men between 1984 and 87 in his home at 4315 Charlotte Street in Kansas City. Growing up in a strict, abusive household, Berdella was socially isolated, with few friends and bullied by other kids. He also struggled with his homosexuality, which he kept hidden, and found solace in art, cooking, and Catholicism after his father's death. Influenced by the film The Collector, Berdella became obsessed with controlling and torturing young men. His first victim was abducted in 1984, held for 28 hours, and suffocated. Over the next few years, he continued his killings, keeping victims like Robert Sheldon and Mark Wallace for days, subjecting them to extreme abuse before murdering them, describing this as, quote, "some of my darkest fantasies becoming my reality," end quote. Berdella's killings were a disturbing mix of sexual desire and sadistic control. Interestingly, his final victim, Christopher Bryson, managed to escape 3 days into captivity. His escape led police to Berdella's home, where they discovered disturbing evidence including torture logs, Polaroids, and remains. Berdella was arrested, and during his trial, he pleaded guilty to multiple murders and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1992, he died of a heart attack while incarcerated, and he was only 43 years old. Arkansas. Randy Gay. Randy William Gay, born September 1st, 1958, endured a troubled childhood marked by abandonment and abuse. His mother left him and his siblings early, and his father, Glenn Harold Gay, was abusive. Randy was also essayed by older boys at the age of 6. At 20 years old, he committed his first murder, killing his 41-year-old father-in-law James Kelly during a family argument. Randy claimed self-defense, but he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years, serving only 9 months before being paroled. In 1991, he did it again, killed his father Glenn Gay during a camping trip. Apparently, after a confrontation, Randy shot his father straight in the head. Randy's wife Janice witnessed the murder and even helped dispose of the body. They initially denied knowing Glenn's whereabouts, but later confessed. Janice was convicted of manslaughter and served 8 months in prison, while Randy received a 20-year sentence, then paroled in 2000. Randy's third and final murder occurred on May 10, 2011, when he killed 49-year-old Connie Ann Snow after an argument at a logging site. He shot her in the face, disposed of her body in Ouachita National Forest, and was arrested the next day. He was charged with capital murder, and after a mistrial in 2013, he was retried in 2015. The prosecution highlighted his 2 prior murders, while the defense cited his abusive upbringing. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, ultimately recommending the death sentence, which was handed down the next day. Louisiana. Red-haired serial killer vanished in the Civil War. I know it's pretty ironic, my hair is currently red, but this isn't about me. Here's one of the most violent and untraceable women in 1800s New Orleans. A red-haired prostitute known as Mary Jane Jackson, or just Bricktop. She was born in 1836 on Garage Street and entered sex work at 13. At 14, she became the mistress of a saloon owner, but when he left her at 17, she beat him so badly he lost an ear. She bounced between different brothels after that. At 20, Mary committed her first murder by beating a man to death for calling her a whore. The next year, she stabbed a 7-foot-tall man known as Long Charlie. But her most infamous murder happened in 1859. She was drinking with 2 women on Rampart Street when a blacksmith, Laurent Flory, told her to stop cursing. She got louder, he slapped her, and all 3 women stabbed him. Police found his money in her pocket, but a failed autopsy got her released. While in jail, Mary began a relationship with John Miller, a criminal and fight manager. In 1861, during an argument, claiming that he needed a thrashing, she fatally stabbed Miller. This led to her being sentenced to 10 years for manslaughter, but released after 9 months due to the Civil War. After getting released, Mary disappeared from New Orleans and was never heard from again. Wisconsin, the Milwaukee Strangler. For over 2 decades, the murders of several women in Milwaukee went unsolved, until a missing DNA sample linked the killings to Walter E. Ellis, a criminal informant with a violent past. Born on June 24th of 1960 in Mississippi, Ellis moved to Milwaukee with his family in the mid-1960s. Marked as antisocial from childhood, his criminal career began in his teens with robbery and escalated to violent crimes. Despite numerous arrests, he became a police informant, though his status was revoked in 1997 due to ongoing offenses. In 1998, he was sentenced for reckless endangerment and served time until 2001. After his release, he returned to Milwaukee working low-skilled jobs. Moving on to May of 2009, DNA analysis linked 7 cold case murders of prostitutes in Milwaukee to a single perpetrator. Investigators discovered that Ellis's DNA, previously missing from earlier forensic tests, matched the murders of the 9 women between 1986 and 2007. Soon after, on September 7th of 2009, Ellis was arrested at a Franklin motel, holding his girlfriend against her will with crack cocaine and a pipe in his possession. He was charged with the murders of 7 women. Ellis's arrest led to the exoneration of Shante Dean Ott and William Avery, who had earlier been suspects in some of the murders. He initially pleaded not guilty, but accepted a plea deal in February of 2011, receiving 7 consecutive life sentences without parole. After being transferred to South Dakota State Penitentiary, his health worsened due to diabetes, and he died on December 1st of 2023 at 53. Illinois murdered 8 nurses in a night of brutality. Richard Benjamin Speck is forever linked to one of the most horrific mass murders in American history. Born on December 6th of 1941 in Kirkwood, Illinois, his troubled childhood set the stage for a violent life. By 1966, Leb's frustrations led to a horrifying crime. On July 13th of that year, Speck broke into a dormitory of South Chicago where he murdered 8 student nurses. He stabbed, strangled, and slashed their throats, leaving one survivor, Corazon Amurao, who later identified him. Speck's early life, again like many on this list, had been marked by instability after his father's death and mother's remarriage. Struggling in school and battling alcoholism, he was even arrested at 13. He then moved to Chicago in the early 60s. He faced a series of failed jobs, culminating in a robbery and essays before the murders. Back to the student murders. The investigation quickly pointed to Speck, whose fingerprints matched those found at the scene. Arrested and convicted in 1967, Speck was sentenced to death, later commuted to 100 to 300 years. While in prison, he gained notoriety for a video in which he confessed to doing it and showing no remorse. He died of a heart attack on December 5th of 1991, one day before his 50th birthday. His sister had him cremated and his ashes scattered in Joliet. Meanwhile, his crimes were depicted in films such as Violated Angels from 1967 and Chicago Massacre, Richard Speck from 2007, and in TV shows like Mindhunter and American Horror Story. Michigan. Lovers turned serial killers at nursing home. In 1987, Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood, both nurses' aides at Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, Michigan, were convicted of murdering 5 elderly women. The 2 women, who were lovers, allegedly smothered their victims as part of a, quote, love bond. Their first victim was an Alzheimer's patient killed in January of 1987. Over the next several months, Graham murdered 4 more women, their ages ranging from 60 to 98. Wood later testified that they turned the selection of victims into a game, trying to spell M-U-R-D-E-R with their initials. The murders were investigated after Wood's ex-husband alerted authorities. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Graham was convicted of 5 murders in 1989 based on Wood's testimony and a confession to Graham's new girlfriend. Wood, in a plea deal, was sentenced to 20 years for second-degree murder. Media coverage of the incident was interesting and included the 1992 true crime book Forever and 5 Days, which raised doubts about Wood's role, suggesting she may have manipulated the events. The case was also featured in Snapped, Killer Couples, and American Horror Story. Wood was released in 2020, while Graham remains incarcerated. Indiana. Serial killer targeted women and children in Gary and Portage. Eugene Victor Britt, born on November 4th of 1957, grew up in a violent, impoverished family in Gary, Indiana. His father's alcoholism and abuse drove him to leave home at 14. By the late 1970s, Britt had already committed his first violent crime, attacking a 17-year-old girl. After serving a 30-year sentence for that crime, he was paroled in 1993, only to spiral into homelessness, drug use, and later murder. Between May and September of 1995, Britt became the prime suspect in the murders of at least 7 women and children in Gary and Portage. His killing spree began after 8-year-old Sarah Lynn Paulson's body was found in August of that year. Investigators linked Britt to the crime after fibers from his uniform were found at the scene. He confessed to killing Paulson and 9 others, claiming he was driven by voices in his head. Britt's victims ranged in age from 8 to 51, and his method of killing was brutal, attacking them from behind, essaying them, and strangling them. He was arrested in November of 95, and after that lengthy trial, he was sentenced to life in prison plus 100 years. That was in 96. He was later convicted of additional murders and sentenced to 245 more years. Britt, still alive and incarcerated at Indiana State Prison, is serving his sentence under the inmate number 963641. Kentucky. The counselor turned killer. Beoria Abraham Simmons II was born on May 17, 1954 in Louisville, Kentucky. He seemed like an upstanding citizen, graduating from college and even working as a halfway house counselor. However, beneath the surface, he harbored a dark secret. Between 1981 and 1983, Simmons kidnapped and murdered 3 women in Jefferson County. The first victim, 15-year-old Robin L. Barnes, was found in a marsh in 1981, shot and R-worded. Just a year later, Shannon House, 29, was discovered in a wooded area, also R-worded and shot, followed by 39-year-old Nancy Bettman, who was found partially nude in 1983. Ballistics linked the crimes, but the police were somehow stumped until 1983, which was when Simmons messed up in an attempted abduction. He tried to abduct a 16-year-old girl, but she stabbed him in self-defense and escaped. She reported him and he was arrested. Investigators found a .36 caliber pistol in his car, which matched the murder weapon they had been looking for. He eventually confessed to the murders, but claimed they were accidental. A twist in the case revealed that another man, Paul Thomas, had actually been wrongfully convicted for a crime Simmons had committed. After Thomas was exonerated, Simmons was convicted of the 3 murders. Initially sentenced to death, Simmons' sentence was reduced to life imprisonment in 2010. He remains incarcerated, serving multiple life sentences. Tennessee. Michael Mullins, A Killer's Path. Michael Mullins struggled with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and drug addiction. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and lived a troubled life. In 1999, it became apparent that somewhere along the way, he'd become a killer. He murdered his first victim, 43-year-old Beatrice Marie Cole, a homeless woman. He essayed and beat her with a brick, then left her body covered with a yellow blanket. Her body was found hours later. In 2008, Mullins did it again. He attacked 79-year-old Jessie Lee Maples in a park, beating her severely. Though she survived the attack, she died in 2012, although her death was not directly linked to Mullins' assault. In 2011, a rather similar incident happened where Mullins attacked 46-year-old Valerie Ector using a concrete block to crush her skull. He then dragged her body across a parking lot before covering it with a blanket. His final victim was 67-year-old Gwendolyn Jackson, whom he beat to death with a brick in 2012. Mullins was arrested shortly after her murder when his DNA was found at the crime scene on a paper bag. Mullins was convicted of 3 murders in 2014 and sentenced to 3 life sentences for the murders, which would run concurrently, and 3 15-year terms for the essays, also to run concurrently. Mississippi, the family killer. Next is Howard Neal, a man with a long history of instability whose violent outbursts left 3 family members dead in Arm, Mississippi. In January of '81, Neal left his job in Texas and drove to Mississippi with his wife and daughter. After dropping them off at a motel, he went to visit his half-brother Bobby, whose daughter Amanda and her cousin Melanie were staying at the ranch. The 4 went for a drive, but tensions rose when one of the girls accused Neal of inappropriate behavior. Later, in a wooded area, Neal shot Bobby, then led the girls deeper into the forest. He essayed Amanda, attempted to essay Melanie, shot them both, then beat and strangled Amanda afterward. The girls' bodies were found a month later in February. Then Bobby's body was discovered yet another month later. Neal was arrested in California for shoplifting, an unrelated crime, though officers found weapons and handcuffs in his vehicle. His wife's testimony is really what helped seal the case. Eventually, Neal confessed and was sentenced to death. though this was later commuted due to intellectual disability. In 2017, during an interview, he also confessed to the 1980 murders of Pamela Duffy and William Lane, two hitchhikers found dead in Ludlow, California. Neal was never charged, though he remains the prime suspect. Then in 2023, Neal's life sentence was reevaluated, and Mississippi Supreme Court ruled he could potentially be considered for parole because of his poor health. Ohio. Bodies in the backyard, more possibly out there. This one's horrifying on so many levels, and it might just be bigger than anyone realized. It all started with a man named Anthony Sowell, known as the Cleveland Strangler, born in East Cleveland, Ohio, to a single mother, Claudia Gertrude Garrison, in an abusive household. At age 10, he began doing messed up things, such as essaying his niece, Leona Davis. Years later, Sowell then enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1978, serving until 85 and receiving commendations, including a Good Conduct Medal. He then went right back to the dark side. He, for instance, served 15 years for a 1989 attack on a pregnant woman and was released in 2005. He then went on to work in a factory, collected unemployment, and sold scrap metal. But he still was not reformed really. All the while, for example, neighbors complained of a foul odor coming from his home. This was a time when Sowell also used online dating, describing himself as a master seeking a submissive partner. Really sinister because it was at this time that women began disappearing in the area, prompting investigators to reopen cold cases. They eventually linked him to these unsolved homicides. Sowell's downfall actually came in 2009 after he had a few drinks and violently attacked and essayed Latundra Billups. On October 29th of that year, police arrived at his home with an arrest warrant. He wasn't there, but he was found and arrested 2 days later. Investigators found 2 bodies buried in the basement, 4 upstairs and in crawl spaces, and 4 more in the backyard. A skull in a bucket brought the total to 11. Most were strangled, gagged, or bound. In 2011, Sowell was convicted of murdering 11 women, primarily African American, and sentenced to death. His conviction was upheld despite multiple appeals, and he died in 2021 from a terminal illness. Alabama. Raymond Eugene Brown's deadly parole. In 1987, Raymond Eugene Brown, a convicted triple murderer, was paroled after serving just 13 years for the brutal killings of his aunt, grandmother, and great-grandmother in 1960. At age 14, Brown had broken into their home, murdering them to steal money for cleats. Despite his violent past, he was released in 1973, later committing violent sexual assaults while intoxicated. How so? Well, apparently in the late 1970s, Brown developed an alcohol addiction, leading him to essay women. In 1980, for example, he essayed and attempted to strangle his apartment manager, leaving her unconscious. Believing she was dead, he fled, but she survived and contacted the authorities. Brown was arrested and returned to prison for violating parole. He was paroled again in 1986 and found work in an auto shop in Montgomery. He moved in with Linda Lamonte, a single mother with 2 kids. He, however, brutally murdered her and her 10-year-old daughter, Shayla Smoke. He stabbed Lamonte repeatedly, including in her abdomen, vagina, rectum, and throat, before turning on Shayla. Brown then essayed the child and stabbed her multiple times. Afterward, he took a Polaroid photo of Lamonte's body, leaving it on the TV screen along with playing cards and a chilling note. Brown was arrested after a traffic accident linked him to the scene of the crime. During his trial, he claimed amnesia, but was convicted and sentenced to death in 1988. His numerous appeals failed, and he remained on death row until his death in 2008. Maine. The Borgia of Maine poisoned her family. Mary A. Cohen, the Borgia of Maine, lived a life marked by death and suspicion. Born Mary A. Knight in 1863, she spent her early years in rural Plymouth, Maine, before marrying Willis W. Bean, a farmer whom she had 3 daughters with. The family quickly became plagued by death. First, their young daughter Gracie was found dead, smothered. And Mary's response to that? Well, she casually mentioned she already knew about it. A couple of years later, both Alice and Mabel died from strange stomach pains. No one seemed to question it. By 1888, Willis too was dead, allegedly from the same stomach pains. And after his death, Mary quickly sold off a farm inherited from him for $2,000. Soon enough, she remarried. But her second husband, George H. Taylor, died under similar stomach pain circumstances. Next, she wed Elias Cohen. Shortly after their marriage, Elias's farm mysteriously burned to the ground, and according to neighbors who came to help with the fire, they saw items packed as though ready to leave. Willis's 8-year-old son became her next victim, with reports that Willis was abused by his stepmother. Not too long, Willis fell ill after eating green apples and died 2 days later from apparent poisoning. An autopsy revealed high levels of arsenic, leading to Mary's arrest. She was convicted of poisoning him and sentenced to life in prison. While incarcerated, her health rapidly deteriorated, and she gave birth to a child who died shortly after. Mary eventually passed away in prison and was buried in Plymouth next to her past victims. New Hampshire, the chameleon killer. There was a man who could slip in and out of identities, leaving behind a trail of unsolved murders, a puzzle that took decades to piece together. Born in Denver on December 23rd of 1943, Terry Peter Rasmussen was just another child of a seemingly normal family. As he grew, his military service in the US Navy as an electrician shaped his future, but it was his messed up desires that would define him. Probably why in the early 1970s, his marriage ended in abuse and violence. And then, using different aliases, including Bob Evans and Curtis Kimball, Terry went on to commit lots of crime and escape detection along the way until after his death. His crimes actually spanned decades, including the 1981 disappearance of Lisa Bowden, a notable victim, and the murder of his wife, Yoon Soon Jun. Now, a lot came up about him, but what stands out is that in 1985, a gruesome discovery in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, revealed the bodies of a woman and two young girls, sealed in barrels. Over 15 years, the victims' names had remained a mystery, until 2000, when another barrel was found, containing even more bodies. This time, it was revealed that one of these might have been Rasmussen's biological daughter. It wasn't until 2017, long after Rasmussen's death in 2010, that the truth was finally uncovered. DNA testing linked him definitively to the Bear Brook murders, solving one of the most chilling cold cases in American history. Vermont. The quiet Christadelphian who hid a killer's mind. Born in 1951, Gary Schaefer moved with his family from Allentown to Springfield, Vermont to join a Christadelphian church. Quiet but athletic, he served in the Navy, was court-martialed for arson, and later worked as a mechanic and church custodian. He married, had 2 kids, one of which died from SIDS, divorced, and lived reclusively after his father's death. But then Schaefer's dark side emerged when he became involved in the disappearances and murders of young girls in Vermont. In 1979, for example, 13-year-old Sherry Nastasia vanished and her skeletal remains were found months later. 2 years later, 12-year-old Teresa Fenton was abducted, beaten, and left to die. Her body would be discovered days later, but it was the 1983 murder of 11-year-old Katie Richards that led to Schaefer's arrest. Witnesses and physical evidence pointed him as the killer. While in custody, Schaefer's crimes unraveled further. He confessed to Fenton's murder and was linked to other unsolved cases. He was tried and sentenced to multiple terms, but the Nastasia case remained unresolved due to his inadmissible confession. After years of imprisonment, Schaefer died in 2023 at the age of 71. His name remains associated with at least 3 murders, though some believe he may have been involved in even more, including the unsolved Connecticut River Valley killings. Massachusetts, the killer nurse. Born Honora Kelly in 1854, Jane Tappan was a nurse whose calm exterior hid a rather monstrous side. Abandoned by her father after her mother's death, she was placed in an orphanage and later adopted by the Tappan family. By 1885, she was training as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital, where her cheery disposition earned her the nickname Jolly Jane, but behind her warm smile, she was anything but kind. Tappan did the opposite of care for her patients. She killed them. Using morphine and atropine, she poisoned her victims, watching with fascination as they drifted in and out of consciousness. Her first confirmed kill was her landlord, Israel Dunham, in 1895. Over the next 6 years, she murdered at least 31 people, with some estimates suggesting the true toll exceeded over 100. She found pleasure in her patients' suffering, even fondling them as they died, claiming it gave her a sexual thrill. Her undoing came in 1901 when she killed the Davis family. After a toxicology test revealed poison in one of her victims, Tappan was arrested. After her arrest, Jane confessed to her crimes, claiming she wanted to be the most prolific killer in history. In 1902, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to Taunton State Hospital for life. Jane Tappan died there on August 17th of 1938 at the age of 84. Rhode Island, the Strangler of Providence. In 1984, Raymond Lasser terrorized Providence, Rhode Island over the course of just a few months, strangling 3 women and attempting to murder a 4th. A drifter and occasional prostitute, Lasser targeted women in the city's downtown area. His victims included 22-year-old Lori Carlucci, an aspiring gospel singer, Wanda Sue Adams, and 58-year-old transient Dolores Nusser. Each woman was found strangled, partially clothed, and discarded in secluded locations. This sparked fears of a serial killer in the city. The investigation took a turn when 14-year-old Carrie Ann Talbot survived a brutal attack in Roger Williams Park. She identified her attacker as a man named Ray. That same day, police arrested Lasser, and he soon confessed to the 3 murders and the assault. His detailed confessions matched crime scene evidence, leading to his conviction. In 1986, Lasser became the first person to be sentenced under Rhode Island's newly enacted life without parole statute, receiving multiple life sentences for his crimes. His brutal murders and chilling confessions cemented his place in Rhode Island's criminal history. He remains incarcerated to this day. Connecticut, the Mad Dog Killings. Joseph Mad Dog Taborski earned his chilling nickname not for his wild behavior, but for the cold way he murdered his victims. He became one of the most feared men in the state. But how did this self-proclaimed Mad Dog get to this point? Taborski's first brush with the law came in 1950 when he murdered liquor store owner Louis Wolfson during a robbery. Despite his conviction, he was freed from death row in 1955 after the Connecticut Supreme Court overturned his case. But freedom did little to change his violent tendencies. After teaming up with fellow criminal Arthur Calambe, also known as Meatball, Taborski embarked on a string of brutal murders. The Mad Dog killings began in December of 1956 with the murder of Edward Krapewski and Daniel Janowski. Both were shot in the head. In the following weeks, Samuel Kahn, Bernard and Ruth Speyer, and John M. Rosenthal would all meet similar fates. It wasn't until February of 57 that Taborski's reign of terror ended. His final victim, a young girl, survived a brutal attack, providing police with critical information. Identified as Taborski, he was arrested and, in a chilling twist, confessed to his crimes, including the 1950 murder of Wolfson. In 1960, after a trial, Taborski was sentenced to death, becoming the last man executed in Connecticut's Old Sparky electric chair. New Jersey, the tagged killer. Khalil Wheeler Weaver, born on April 20th of 96 in Orange, New Jersey, appeared to lead a normal life. Raised in a family of law enforcement, he had a few friends and was socially isolated in high school. As of 2016, he worked as a security guard, but that seemed to be the only good side to him. Wheeler Weaver apparently had this other side where he used the dating site Tagged to lure women, mostly sex workers, offering them money before offing them. He targeted vulnerable women, including 19-year-old Robin West, 20-year-old Sarah Butler, and 33-year-old Joanne Brown. He would meet them in secluded places, strangle them, and leave their bodies out for anyone to find. To avoid getting caught, he wore gloves and condoms, leaving little evidence behind. Fate had other plans though, because in one of his escapades, Tiffany Taylor, his only survivor, managed to escape and inform the police. Unknown to him, his phone's geolocation tracked his movements to where he met his victims and dumped their bodies. He also searched for homemade poison to kill humans on his phone, and DNA found under one victim's fingernails eventually tied him to the murders. A year later, Sarah Butler's sister created a fake profile to lure him to a meeting leading to his capture. In 2019, he was convicted of 3 murders, attempted murder, other charges, and sentenced to 160 years in prison. Come 2022, he was charged with another murder, that of 15-year-old Mawa Doumbia, whose remains were found in 2019. New York, Arthur Shawcross and the Genesee River murders. Arthur Shawcross, born in 1945, grew up in a troubled household showing early signs of violent behavior, including claims that his mother and sister SA'd him at age 7 and while in junior high school. He went on and got drafted into the army during the Vietnam War and would then return home with disturbing stories, including grotesque boasts of war crimes. The years that followed saw him sink to crime. After serving time for arson and burglary, for example, he shocked his entire community with the brutal murders of 2 children in 1972. Shawcross apparently killed 10-year-old Jack Blake and 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill, both of whom were SA'd and strangled. Despite the heinous nature of the crimes, he stuck a plea deal and was convicted of manslaughter, receiving a 25-year sentence. He was released after serving only 14 years, and he moved to Rochester, New York. Between 1988 and 1989, he would go back to his ways and he targeted vulnerable women, mostly prostitutes, strangling and mutilating them before dumping their bodies along the Genesee River. His capture came in 1990 after an intensive investigation linked him to the killings. In court, Shawcross claimed PTSD from his time in Vietnam, but the jury found him guilty of 10 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison and spent his final years behind bars before dying in 2008 from cardiac arrest. Pennsylvania, he killed his friends for saying no. Next up is John Charles Eichinger, a grocery store clerk from Malvern who murdered 4 people, including a toddler, because his advances were rejected. Born in 1972, Eichinger grew up quiet, nerdy, and deeply into Dungeons & Dragons. That's actually how he met his future victims, Jennifer Still and Heather Greaves. He asked Jennifer out in 1999, she said no, so he brought out a knife which he was carrying and stabbed her to death. He kept the gloves, knife, and blood-stained clothes as trophies. And get this, he held the same knife and wore the Scream mask as his Halloween costume for years. Then in 2005, he tried the same with Heather. This time it was worse. He brought the birthday flowers, which she had him deliver, then confessed his feelings for her. She turned him down too. He stabbed her in the throat right in front of her sister Lisa and 3-year-old daughter Avery, then killed them both so as to not leave any witnesses behind. When police finally tracked him down, Eichinger sat calmly through questioning until he noticed the detective's holstered gun. That's when he suddenly broke down and confessed. his reason being that the grocery store he worked at had a strict policy to never resist a man with a gun, and somehow, in his twisted mind, that still applied. He got 3 death sentences and 1 life sentence, and still sits on death row at SEI Phoenix. Delaware, the Route 40 killer who chose his own death. Stephen Brian Pennell, known as the Route 40 Killer, is Delaware's most notorious serial killer. Between 1987 and 88, he abducted and murdered several women along US Route 40, a major highway. His first known victim, 23-year-old Shirley Ellis, was found brutally murdered, with signs of torture and strangulation. 7 months later, 31-year-old Catherine DeMauro met a similar fate, her body discovered with signs of violent struggle. Pennell's subsequent victims included sex workers Margaret Lynn Finner and Michelle Gordon. Their bodies were found months after their disappearances, showing signs of torture, though Gordon had also been drugged with cocaine before her death. Police struggled to track him until an undercover officer posing as a sex worker managed to observe fibers in his car and gathered evidence that led the police straight to him. Pennell was arrested in November of 1988. The trial that followed was anything but ordinary. In an unusual move, Pennell decided to represent himself and openly asked for the death penalty. He argued that, according to the Bible, he deserved to die for his crimes. In 1991, he was sentenced to death, and on March 14th of 1992, Pennell was executed by injection, becoming the first person in Delaware in 46 years to face such execution. Maryland. He strangled women in the hour before sunrise. They called him the Dawn Strangler because he always struck just before sunrise while the city slept. Nathaniel Lipscomb was born in Gaffney, South Carolina in 1929, and by his teens, he was already peeping into windows and stealing bikes. With an IQ of 51 and marked impulsive, he spent time in jail and mental institutions before fading into the background until 1951. That's when a mother in Charlotte, North Carolina, was stabbed to death in her bed while her 4-year-old daughter watched. Lipscomb confessed, then backtracked, then confessed again. He said it was an accident. He was institutionalized, declared unfit, then quietly released. By 1958, he'd moved to Baltimore, and women started dying again. His first known victim there, May Hall, was found in a neighbor's yard. A few days later, Lottie Kite was strangled just steps from her home. Then came Pearl Weiss, who he ambushed after she got off a bus. She was found dead, her shoes missing. Another woman, Ethel Francis, was attacked on a golf course. Police suspected Lipscomb but never proved it. He was arrested eventually, and in 1961, Lipscomb was put to death in the gas chamber at the Maryland State Penitentiary. He became the last man executed in the state before Furman v. Georgia put a halt to capital punishment nationwide. Virginia. The killer who terrorized Alexandria. Monty Russell was a serial killer and R-worder who operated in Virginia during the 1970s, committing 5 murders and R-wording 12 women between 1976 and 77. His crimes were characterized by extreme violence and brutality. Russell's first murder occurred in August of 1976 when he killed a prostitute, Ara Marina Gabor, drowning her in a ravine. Over the next several months, he murdered 4 more women, including a McDonald's manager trainee and a post office clerk, using methods such as stabbing and drowning. Russell's killing spree came to an end in May of 1977 when he was apprehended by police who had been watching him closely after connecting him to the killings. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences in 77, just months after his arrest. Despite his horrific crimes, Russell became eligible for parole in 95, sparking protests from the victims' families and their community. He remains incarcerated to this day, currently at the Beaumont Correctional Center. His case became widely known, especially after his crimes were featured in the first season of the Netflix show Mindhunter, where he was portrayed by actor Sam Strike. West Virginia. The nurse who killed veterans. In 2017, the Lewis A. Johnson Veterans Medical Center in Clarksburg became the setting for a disturbing series of deaths. Retta Mays had served in the military and worked as a corrections officer at the hospital. With no certification or license to administer medication, she quietly stalked and harmed her victims, mostly elderly veterans. Over the span of nearly a year, she injected at least 7 of them with lethal doses of insulin. The hospital staff initially attributed the deaths to natural causes, but the rapid succession of unexplained fatalities raised suspicions. Mays worked overnight shifts on Ward 3A, where patients suffered mysterious drops in blood sugar. One victim, 84-year-old Archie Edgell, had his blood sugar plummet to dangerously low levels, only to die after being stabilized. The cause later linked to insulin injections. After her firing in 2018, an extensive investigation uncovered a pattern of murders. Mays was arrested in 2020 and pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She cited PTSD and that it gave her a sense of control amidst personal and professional chaos. chaos. On May 11, 2021, Mays was sentenced to 7 life terms plus 20 years without parole and fined $172,000. Tearfully, she apologized in court as the judge called her, quote, the monster that no one sees coming, end quote. She was later sent to FCI Aliceville in Alabama, despite a recommendation for mental health care elsewhere. Civil suits with 10 victims' families have since been settled. North Carolina, he stopped feeling pain. Samuel James Cooper's story began in violence and never left it. Born in North Carolina in 1977, he grew up in a household ruled by abuse. His father beat him from the time he was only 3 months old. By age 13, Samuel stopped crying. A psychiatrist later said he stopped, quote, feeling fear or feeling pain, end quote. As an adult, Cooper turned violent. In 1994, he committed a series of armed robberies and ended up in prison. While serving time, though, he escaped prison by attacking a guard. Months later, in court for that escape, he tried to take a deputy's gun. Somehow, he still served time and got let out, and after his release in 2006, the killings began. In just over a year, he murdered 5 men, some during robberies, others for reasons still unknown. The victims were Osama Haj Hussein, Leroy Jernigan, Timothy Barnwell, Ricky High, and Tariq Hussein. He would have actually gotten away with it were he not arrested after a bank robbery in November of 2007, when he dropped the handgun. The gun linked him to the murders. At trial, the defense cited his traumatic childhood. Prosecutors argued that he killed because he wanted to. The jury spared him the death penalty, but only barely. Samuel Cooper is now serving 5 life sentences at Warren Correctional Institution. South Carolina. Called newspaper and confessed to multiple murders. In South Carolina, we've got the story of Leroy Martin, also known as the Gaffney Strangler, and it's one of the most disturbing from the 1960s. Martin was a textile mill worker, married with 3 kids, living what seemed like a normal life in Cherokee County. But between 1967 and 1968, he R-worded and murdered 4 people, 2 adult women and 2 teenage girls. The killings might have gone unsolved if Martin hadn't picked up the phone and ratted on himself. In February of 1968, he anonymously called the editor of the Gaffney Ledger and gave directions of 2 hidden bodies. He also claimed he, not the man already in prison, was responsible for a murder from a year before. That man, Roger Dedmond, had been wrongfully convicted of killing his wife. Thanks to Martin's tip, Dedmond was released 10 months into his sentence, but the killer wasn't done yet. Just days after that phone call, 15-year-old Opal Buxton was abducted. Locals spotted Martin's car, and police arrested him within weeks. He confessed to all 4 murders and got 4 life sentences. Though many believe Martin intentionally targeted his victims, especially young women, he claimed in prison interviews that a violent split personality is what drove his actions. On May 31st of 72, he was stabbed to death by fellow inmate Kenneth Rumsey, who later died by suicide in prison 5 years later. Georgia. The poisoner who killed her family for insurance. In a small town in Georgia, Janie Lou Gibbs was known as a loving mother, grandmother, soft-spoken daycare operator, and church member. But over the span of just 2 years, this seemingly gentle woman used poison to murder her entire family. It started with her husband, Charles. January of '66, Janie served him a warm, home-cooked dinner laced with arsenic. When he was hospitalized, she brought him soup with even more poison. He died days later, and doctors blamed liver disease. Janie cashed in the life insurance and gave generously to the church. 8 months later, her 13-year-old son Marvin died the same way. Then 16-year-old Melvin, same symptoms, same generous donations. Still no suspicions. By early 1967, only one son remained, 19-year-old Roger. He had a newborn, Ronnie. The baby died first, then Roger. When the family doctor raised questions, autopsies confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Every one of them had been poisoned. Janie Lou Gibbs was arrested on Christmas Day. Found mentally unfit to stand trial, she was placed in a mental institution. Later, she was tried and sentenced to 5 life terms. Released in 1999 due to Parkinson's disease into the custody of her sister, she died in 2010 in a nursing home in Douglasville, Georgia. Florida. The execution of Eileen Wuornos. Born in Rochester, Michigan, 1956, Eileen Wuornos never met her father. He hung himself in prison when she was a toddler. By age 11, Wuornos was engaging in relations at school in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food, and had also been involved with her brother. She claimed her alcoholic grandfather SA'd and beat her as a child, forcing her to strip before the abuse. In 1970, at 14, she became pregnant after being SA'd by a family friend. She gave birth at a home for unwed mothers at 14. In her 20s, she hitchhiked across the country, eventually landing in Florida, surviving as a sex worker. Between 1989 and 90, she murdered 7 men, most found shot, their bodies dumped along highways. She claimed they tried to SA her. Police caught her in 1991, and in 92, she was convicted of killing Richard Mallory, a man she insisted assaulted her first. More convictions followed. She was sentenced to death 6 times. She spent over a decade on death row, first at Broward Correctional, then Florida State Prison. In 2001, she dropped all appeals, saying she wanted to die. Her mental state declined. She accused guards of poisoning her food and complained of abuse, strip searches, and mildew-soaked mattresses. On October 9th of 2002, Eileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She drank a cup of coffee and said, "I'll be back, with Jesus." Her ashes were scattered beneath a Michigan tree, and her life, clearly an interesting one, became the subject of books, films, and songs. Alright guys, that was one serial killer from every state. But hopefully you liked the way I presented the information, and maybe I earned your subscription. I definitely earned a like. Like, come on. But with that being said, make sure to go follow me on Instagram at MyNameIsTuv, check out my Twitter at MyNameIsTuv with 2 V's, and go stream my music on Spotify. I hope you guys liked this one, and I will see you guys next time I upload.